metaphorically speaking, there's an approaching storm.
You guys know what this represents?
Tell us, sir.
Maybe it's the calm before the storm. What the storm could be, the calm before the storm. We have the world's great military people in this room, I will tell you that. And we're going to have a great evening. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
What storm, Mr. President?
You'll find out. Thank you, everybody.
I read this the other day and I said, wow, that's really amazing. It's really incredible. And it's the snake lyric. On her way to work one morning, down the path along the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor, half-frozen snake. Interesting. His pretty-colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. Oh, well, she cried, I'll take you in, and I'll take care of you.
I'll tell you about a few of the things that I have learned during these last 5 years of intensive research. Perhaps the most startling thing that I can share with you is that all of the conspiracy theories that you've ever heard about one world government, about the UN takeover of the world.
To build a constructive, peaceful world order. It's very great. A world order. A world order. A world order. It's very great.
A friend of mine, I've liked him, I've respected him, but we've been friends for a long time, long before my emergence in the world of politics, which has not been too long. But we have been really I guess you'd say the New York City a little bit, but we got to know each other very well. He's a man I have great, great respect for.
All of those conspiracies have now been laid to rest. There's nothing conspiratorial about it. It's all published.
Well, we're headed to the United Nations to meet with the Assistant Secretary General to talk about the violence in Chicago, the gun violence in particular, the bloodshed that's taking place in too many of our communities like Austin, West Garfield Park, North Mondale, places like that, where we've just seen horrific levels of shootings and that sort of thing. And so I'm hoping to appeal to the UN to actually come to Chicago and meet with victims of violence and maybe even possibly help out in terms of peacekeeping efforts, because I think it's so critical for us to make sure that these neighborhoods are safe. Quite frankly, we failed the people of Chicago in many instances in these communities because we failed to protect them from the violence. I'll also say this, that there is a quiet genocide taking place in too many of our communities. 80% of those who are being killed by gun violence are African American.
The UN-funded Commission on Global Governance began meeting in 1992 in earnest and met for 4 years, and last fall released their final report. It is entitled Our Global Neighborhood. Here are the things that they wish to do. Create a world-standing army under the day-to-day command of, who else? The UN Secretary General. They recommend the creation of a new Economic Security Council, into which the World Bank,
Well, last of the Rothschild Bank hit list. The list is getting smaller and smaller. Back in 2000, there were only 7 countries, looking at this article, 7 countries without a Rothschild-owned central bank. Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. So, here we go. A few years later, 2003, we're down to 5. Got rid of Iraq, right? Saddam Hussein, who's gone. And, actually there's a little theory behind that. Saddam Hussein might have been dead before the war actually started. It might have been his brothers actually running the country. I give a little credence to that theory because that change of policy didn't make sense. And the guy they hung at the end in Iraq, supposedly was Saddam Hussein. No way in hell, because, even as an amateur, I looked at him and I saw the teeth were all crooked. Saddam Hussein had perfect teeth. But the point of the story is they got rid of the problem in Iraq, and they installed the Rothschild Central Bank, and they went back to using U.S. dollars for trading oil. And, of course, Afghanistan, we invaded Afghanistan. They changed their central bank, so the list was down to 5. Now, a few years later, in 2011, 2012, it's down to 3 nations. Sudan had their revolutions, and, Shell oil companies in there, and they're always having these freaking problems with the oil pipelines, rebels and stuff. But, sometimes I'm going to give you a little insight on that. I'm pretty sure what the deal is. That's to manipulate the price of oil up and down when they need to store it, Sometimes I think the actual rebels are being paid for by the oil companies. They want the price to go up, have an attack on the oil lines. That's in the Sudan. And, of course, what happened in Libya. Colonel Gaddafi basically executed, and Hillary laughed. Ha, 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 ha. So we got 3 countries left. And, I want to point out, of the 3 that's left, Venezuela is not on the list. Because, Hugo Chavez, a lot of people thought he was the major dictator in a way he was, but, there's always the power behind the scenes. Chavez I don't think Chavez had anything to do with devaluing the Bolivar in Venezuela several times over the last many years, because I think the central banks are other people that control that, and Chavez, he has nothing to do with it. He basically was a popular leader. Although a communist, I can tell you one thing, he actually took the communism to heart. The guy did good shit too. He actually did. He was against it. He was a thorn in his side to the Western establishment, but he did good things too. I know because he just died recently. He actually did good things. He actually did care about the poor people. But when the Bolivar was devalued, you got to remember that bank was in other hands other than Chavez, and they're not on the list, are they? The last 3 are that are owned by the Rothschild family. It wasn't even Venezuela, wasn't even on the list back here in 2000. So it goes to show you the power behind the throne was the central banks in Venezuela. So the 3 that are left are Cuba, North Korea, and
U.S. and North Korea. President Trump and Kim Jong-un trading threats of military action, each more severe than the last. After the president warned the U.S. was locked and loaded, North Korea responded with a threat of its own, promising tragic doom to America. Here's ABC's chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz.
Today, a new warning from Kim Jong-un's regime after nearly a week of threats on both sides. North Korean state media sending this message. If the Trump administration does not want the American empire to meet its tragic doom, they had better talk and act properly. The threat comes after North Korea earlier this week said it was crafting a plan to send 4 missiles to the waters off Guam. And its latest message clearly a response to President Trump's string of warnings from his Friday tweet saying the U.S. military is locked and loaded to his latest.
And if anything happens to Guam, there's going to be big, big trouble in North Korea.
North Korea and Iran. And you pretty much know what's going to happen there. You know what's going to happen. Probably, I thought last year was going to be.
National Monetary Fund, the United Nations Development Program, and the World Trade Organization would all be consolidated. A unified worldwide banking scheme, currency. I don't think I need to draw any more pictures on that point. Now, those non-government organizations like ours that are not accredited by the UN, we are called populist trash, activists who can destroy, they say, in a moment, years of deliberation. And you're darn right. I have been challenged on the radio and in audiences like this. Mr. Lamb, there's no such thing as a global agenda. Hey, friend, you're absolutely wrong. Here it is. It's called Agenda 21. Agenda 21, the primary document presented in Rio de Janeiro and adopted by more than 100 heads of state, including George Bush, which lays out in intricate detail all of the transformation that must take place in society in order for it to become sustainable as they define sustainability. This may be available at the United Nations bookstore. I had to pick this up. I had not seen one until last July, had not been able to get one. I happened to be in Geneva attending a United Nations meeting, and I went to the bookstore and bought the thing. I believe it cost $45. The Conference of the Parties held its first meeting in Nassau last December. At that first meeting, the United Nations Environment Program presented them with a global biodiversity assessment. Started in 1992 with a grant from the Global Environment Facility for $3.3 million, orchestrated and coordinated by the World Resources Institute and the World Wildlife Fund and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This is 1,140 pages that explains how to implement the 16-page treaty on biodiversity. The last 200 pages, section 13, deals specifically with a system of protected areas. It defines what a system of protected areas is. It includes core wilderness areas surrounded by buffer zones, similar to those used in the biosphere reserves, created under a UNESCO program and promoted by the United States Man in the Biosphere program. There are 382 biosphere reserves around the world, 47 of which are in the United States, not under authority of any treaty, but by voluntary agreement with the United Nations. These biosphere reserves are to be the nucleus for the core wilderness areas. Scratching my head here, what on earth is going on? And then I stumbled on page 993, and friends, if you don't think that's some heavy reading at night, page 993, after describing these protected areas, sums it all up by saying, the recently published Wildlands Project in the United States is the central theme of protected areas. And on page 15 of the Wildlands Project, Dr. Reed Noss says that we must convert at least 50% of the land area of North America to wilderness, off limits to human beings. Those core wilderness areas are to be interconnected by wilderness corridors off limits to human beings. Those wilderness areas are to be surrounded by buffer zones that may have limited resource use under the supervision and permitting of the federal government, in collaboration with non-government organizations. Human population is to be resettled into the remaining 25% of the land, into communities that are described as sustainable communities. Now let me put a parenthesis right here for a moment. He created what he called a White House task force on ecosystem management. He called 20 federal departments together and said, you will create an ecosystem management policy, and you will implement the ecosystem management policy throughout the federal government. Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Education, throughout the federal government. They developed what they called multimedia enforcement. Where they run into a problem with a community that will not accept this ecosystem management concept, multimedia enforcement means that all 20 federal agencies descend on the community and begin inspections and writing tickets. I couldn't believe it.
The document calls for literally reducing the human population by as much as 2/3 to 3/4 in the next 30 to 50 years. It could set aside up to 1/2 of the American landscape into wilderness areas interconnected by wilderness corridors, all surrounded by human buffer zones in which human activities are highly regulated. That is very, very clear in these United Nations documents that they want to set up a regulatory structure that would affect every man, woman, and child on planet Earth, and all of the control would be headquartered in the United Nations. And if we take the more recent United Nations documents, it's going to be called the Trusteeship Council in the restructure of the United Nations that's occurring right now. And the Man in the Biosphere Program, as revealed in the U.S. State Department documents as well as UNESCO documents, clearly show that the Man in the Biosphere Program actually is the first step in implementing the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there are 47 of these Man in the Biosphere programs around this nation that occupy about 51 million acres of U.S. soil.
World Heritage Sites are many of our national parks. In fact, 68% of our national parks land base is now under UNESCO's World Heritage Site. And that includes the symbol of independence in America.